Hi everyone, my name is Wayne Haag. I've been an artist in the film industry for 28 years. Today I'm going to go over how I broke into the industry, but more specifically how Alejandro Jodorowsky's and Moebius's graphic novel, The Incal, helped me land my first job as a matte painter, and specifically landed me that matte painting job on The Fifth Element. So this is The Incal. This is the cover of book 2. There are 3 books in this series. I will show you specifically the panels that were instrumental in me becoming a matte painter on The Fifth Element. Very, very quick history. This is me. This is my first year as an apprentice working as an electronic technician. I show you this because it was at this factory. Let me zoom out here a little bit. It was at that factory that I built this pin registration board. There's 2 pins here. They're designed to match, or they matched, a standard paper punch. And this bracket here is used to clamp this whole system to a table or a desk. And I would pin 4x5" sheet film on here and light it from behind and re-photograph from the front. And there's a piece of sheet film with the holes punched. So this is the sort of thing I was into and the stuff I was experimenting with prior to Photoshop. There's those 2 X-Wings from the prior shot with the robot guy, the model kits that I would make, the Millennium Falcon of course, and I'm going to show you some of the process for that. You can see the pins from the pin registration bar or the holes. So this was my lead up. I was discovering how all this worked and how compositing worked using litho film. I don't have any of the original masks that were created by the litho film. Litho film is a clear or black emulsion. So it gives you a perfectly clear base and a very opaque black masking shape, just like channels in Photoshop. This is a very simplified version of how guys like ILM, and optical compositors of the 70s and 80s and so on would create this sort of work. Millennium Falcon model kit suspended by fishing wire. This is what's called a beauty pass. It's my sort of main key light and some reflected fill light there. So that's how I want the ship to look in the final composited image. I turn all those key lights off, the beauty lights off, and then I light the model from behind. From this particular transparency here, I've created a litho film mask. So this was the goal. This shot here, the purpose of this shot is to get this matte. So what this is the black opaque of the litho film or the litho emulsion with a clear base. You create an opposite litho by contact printing this against the litho film again, and you get this. The reason you want this is to then create that. And so I have a piece of film in the camera and I photograph that shot with this over the top. Okay, so what you get is this. So there's the black of the matte of the litho holding out and blocking off everything except the ship itself. What happens is that this area is exposed inside the camera, and I do a multiple exposure afterwards to get the rest of the image. So the goal is to then get these 2 shots. So that's the matte that holds out and does not expose that area. This is the matte that holds out and doesn't expose the background while we're exposing the Millennium Falcon. That is for that, and that is for that. And so these 2 shots here are happening as a multiple exposure on the one piece of film. These are not happening as separate photographs. These are happening as 1 or 2 exposures on the one piece of film. Okay? And then the result is the final composite. So it was knowing this and understanding how this process worked that allowed me to grasp Photoshop pretty quickly. And then during my second year, I think it was towards the end of my second year, in the computer lab, they had the Macintoshes set up, they had Photoshop, and they were running version 1.6. And overnight, Photoshop basically eliminated my need to do any of this. I never went back into a darkroom ever again. These are the 35mm slides, or transparencies mounted onto black card. So this was my final year portfolio from RMIT. I took them around to some of the production companies around Melbourne. One of the companies I went to, I met a guy and he said, no chance, nobody in Australia does matte paintings, and if they did, that was a long time ago, and we just don't do that. Certainly not digital matte paintings, nothing of the sort. He said, a girl that I went through school with, her name is Karen Ansell, and she works at ILM. You should contact her and ask her advice. So I did just that. I looked up Karen and I called ILM and I spoke to her because Karen was an Australian, she was from Melbourne, and I called her up one day and I asked her, I said, what's your advice? How do I break into the film industry? And she said, well, I went to a conference called SIGGRAPH, explained the conference, what it was about, and I was like, right on. She said it took her 5 years from the first SIGGRAPH to finally break in by going each year. And I said, okay, well, that gives me a target. But before I got there, I wanted to start making contact with companies, visual effects companies, or any visual effects company that might have been involved in doing matte paintings. And so I went through the Cinefex magazines. It's probably the best journal on film industry, visual effects and special effects that was ever published. Unfortunately, they've since gone out of print. So what I would do, is I would find ads like this, find out what the companies were, there'd be addresses, there'd be phone numbers, and there might be contact details of the people involved. And I would take notes of these different companies that were that had anything that mentioned anything about matte painting, and I would just make a list, contacts, these phone numbers, these people, and I called them, like Hunter Gratzner, visual effects, miniatures, mechanical effects. I learnt which companies were involved in doing any sort of matte painting and which ones were not. And so this magazine was fantastic for that, of just going through and finding all of the contact details. It's an amazing magazine, by the way. Just the history of cinema, visual effects, special effects, cinema is just incredible. Wow, look at this. The Fifth Element. This is a little bit meta. I'm jumping ahead, but that would be an example maybe of an ad. That is Ron Gress, and that's Mark Stetson. Mark Stetson was the lead model maker on Blade Runner. Ron Gress was one of the, if not the key painter, who painted the Enterprise miniature on Star Trek The Motion Picture. These guys are legends, absolute legends. Oh, a little bit of fast forwarding here. FS11 shot, matte painting, and the TR8 matte painting. So I worked on both of those. And the Lilu diving off the ledge shot is also my matte painting. My portfolio secured me the job within new media. I wasn't being hired by Digital Domain in their film visual effects side. It was their new media department. In other words, games. They were thinking of branching into games at the time, and they developed they were developing some games. And I thought, fine by me. A foot in the door is a foot in the door. So I said yes, and I took the position. It was from that point that I had to come back to Australia. So I accepted the job. Some of the paperwork was done, and I had to wait 9.5 months for the immigration papers and so on, and that process to go through. And then when I came back to America, so I sold everything I owned, moved to the US, moved to LA. On the first day of that job,
I was told that science fiction game did not exist.
You can imagine how I felt. I'd come all that way to be working on at least a big science fiction game, which would have been cool, and it didn't exist at all. But they had these 3 games, none of which interested me at all. That was Monday. Tuesday, I'd been out to get a coffee, and I walked past this particular gentleman, and he was reading the Incal. This was the frame that I saw. So Ron Gress, Mr. Ron Gress. I'll put a link down in the description to another YouTube video where Ron is being interviewed, and you can learn a bit more about Ron. He has quite a history in special effects. So Ron was reading this, and his book was open to that page, and I walked past and I saw this panel right here, and I saw this vehicle shooting into the middle of that, and this sort of explosion of light. As soon as I saw that, I exclaimed, "That's the Incal." And he turned around and he said, "Yes, it is. Where are you from?" "I've come all the way from Melbourne, all the way from Australia, and I find out that the reason I was hired doesn't exist anymore." I said, "But I want to be a matte painter." And he said, we need matte painters for a film that we're working on or about to start working on that's based on this book, or based on some of the work that the artist created, Mobius's work." So I rushed off and got my 35mm slides, those mounted slides that you've seen, and I said, "Here's my portfolio." And he said, "Wayne, these are great." And that was Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, I had been transferred into the film department, and I was officially signed on as a matte painter for The Fifth Element. I could have been walking past Ron's cubicle and looked to my left instead of my right, that I stopped and saw him reading that at that moment. Some might call it divine intervention, synchronicity, I don't care what you call it, but it was certainly, go back to this camera, it was a moment that I can't explain. And I think, some other people have said this before, that you have to be prepared for when, luck strikes. You prepare yourself so that when luck arrives, you can grasp that, you can jump onto that and go for it. And I certainly did. As soon as I saw Ron reading that, I jumped on it, and I don't know why, apart from the fact that I loved reading the Incal and I was, into that. I mean, the cool thing about that job was that I met not just Ron Gress, but Mark Stetson, who was the VFX supervisor on The Fifth Element, who became the VFX supervisor on Lord of the Rings. So the Incal is responsible not just for me getting work as a matte painter on The Fifth Element, it was responsible for me getting work as a matte painter on The Lord of the Rings. My eternal gratitude to Ron Gress, may he rest in peace, he is no longer with us, and Mark Stetson, Karen Galikis, the CG supervisor on The Fifth Element, and all the fantastic people that I met there at Digital Domain at that time. Kevin Mack in particular, who was a great mentor, and Les Ecker, some fantastic people that I met. It's an experience I'll always treasure. And so that's my story of becoming a matte painter on The Fifth Element, thanks to Mobius and Jodorowsky. Well, that's a brief look back into how I broke into the film industry. Hopefully this story inspires you in some way. In the meantime, happy painting, take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.